eye on letting people in, but also speaking at the same time, which is, as funnily enough, as we're going to be talking about demands, multitasking is something that we're inherently bad at. Research shows us. But thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Lucy Truman. I'm an organisational psychologist and founder of Truman Change and Reimagine Events. So Truman Change is a consultancy business all about change and transformation in public sector, and Reimagine Events is an events business all about helping people to change and transform in the public sector. So my cup of tea is very much how do we deliver public services really well, and when we need to change things, how do we do that really well? We've got a really great panel today, which I will introduce shortly. Just wanted to give you the heads up. We are recording this. You should have had a notification as you joined, but it only records you if you are speaking. So if you would rather not be recorded, but you want to ask a question, then just send it, put it in the chat or send it to me as a chat. Because they're very interactive, these, and we wouldn't want you to feel like you couldn't take part. But I'm super aware that this particular topic is quite a sensitive one. So you may want to pose questions without identifying yourself. That's absolutely fine. We can facilitate that, no problem. So today's session has come from an observation, really. So I have come from a local authority background and done a lot in different local authority services, but only really in the last kind of 18 months, 2 years, I've got into housing as a sector within local government, but also housing associations as well. And one of the things that I have noticed, because we often get brought in to talk about culture and to talk about behaviour and how staff are doing and how do we get staff on board with a change programme. But one of the things I've noticed is that the emotional demands of work in the housing sector is extraordinarily high when you compare it to other sectors where it is also extraordinarily high. So things like emergency services and social workers and, you know, people that are really at the front line of helping vulnerable people in challenging situations. There is often a lot of acceptance that that's emotionally demanding, and training and supervision and support. And I'm not sure we're there yet with housing. So this was a conversation that started as a bit of a reflection of, oh, should we be helping our people a bit more with these really challenging issues? And so we thought we're still in the early stages of really researching and understanding this. So this is a very informal call, and we would really welcome other people's perspectives. But joining us today, we have, first of all, Justin Hunt, who works with us at Truman Change. You want to just introduce yourself, Justin?
Hi, thanks, Lucy. Yes, so I'm Justin Hunt, and I've been working in housing for the last 30 plus years. Started life as a housing officer and worked my way up to director level, mostly in London boroughs, but also in housing associations and outside London as well. And yeah, 18 months ago, I started working with Lucy as an associate consultant, housing specialist for Truman Change. So yeah, that's my background.
Thank you, Justin. And we also have Adrian joining us today. And I'm really excited that Adrian's joining us because he is recently retired as a council chief exec, but has also done a lot of work in different services. So he's able to really give us that perspective of how other areas besides housing manage this particular topic. So do you want to just say hello, Adrian, and tell everyone a bit about yourself?
Hi, everybody. I'm Adrian Loades. I was, as Lucy said, interim chief executive with the London Borough of Redbridge for 16 months before retiring in late January this year. My substantive role with Redbridge was corporate director of people, so that was children's services and adult services. And I've been a director of children's services and director of adult social services for about 14 years, first in Cambridgeshire and then in Redbridge. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much for joining us, Adrian. So Justin, if I come to you first, because obviously you're the person that has been embedded within the sector for a long time, do you want to just talk me through maybe a bit about the history? Because I think some of it is that the reason why maybe there is less support is because traditionally housing services were really about bricks and mortar and housing, and now are we asking people to deal with a very different kind of world? So do you want to just talk us through a little bit about that from your perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So funnily enough, the whole thing arose because we were working with housing officers, and the question came up, which is, has the role of frontline housing staff changed in the last 30 years? And I answered that question in my head. I said, yes, it definitely had, and asked about 100 senior colleagues now for their views on it and whether or not that had changed. And every single one of them said, yes, it had. And the primary thing is that whilst technology has helped, so there are aspects of what the job does which has definitely improved, there are probably three categories in the way it's become a much more demanding job. So you've got demand from more complex residents, the people that would have been housed in the 50s, 60s and 70s. Due to change in legislation, that has increasingly changed. And so you're housing people with far more complex needs in terms of mental health, drug, alcohol abuse, all sorts of different vulnerabilities. And that is creating challenges and demands on the service that previously wouldn't have been there in previous decades. There has been a withdrawal of other parts of the public sector. So that is for multiple different reasons. The threshold in which other parts of the public sector will engage with people living in our properties has changed. And then probably the third thing is that as a result of the housing crisis in all sorts of different ways, which is a whole debate in itself, the flexibility around stock in terms of moving people around and the options that are available is reduced as well. And so those are the three primary reasons, but I'm sure people on the call will be able to come up with a whole load of other aspects, which has led to a change in the way the role has gone. And if you include operatives going into properties and homelessness officers who are assessing people coming through the front door, it is a very complex and demanding job. It then raised the question, which is, okay, so if it's more challenging, what is it a member of staff could expect if they were going to be operating in the housing sector? And I started to sort of think about that and came up with really quite a long list of challenges that I'd experienced in my 30 years. And again, speaking with senior colleagues, they all had a similar list relating to that. And that was, and the examples that I managed to come up with, I started to write down, and I quickly realized that I couldn't go through those examples on this call because so many of them were so challenging and so graphic. I had to talk in generalities around it. So we're talking decanting tower blocks, we're talking suicides, we're talking graphic deaths in properties, we're talking cuckooing of vulnerable residents, we're talking violence in reception areas, violence in people's homes in terms of what it is that people, frontline staff, have experienced. I've had to chair panels where people communicated quite serious mental health issues as members of staff due to personal circumstances, high levels of drug and alcohol use in terms of coping mechanism and trying to work that through as representing the employer. Yeah, I mean, the list goes on. I'm sure that colleagues on the call would be able to do that. And so again, it sort of raised the question of, if that's what somebody coming to the sector is going to have to work their way through, how are we managing that? And again, I reflected on starting in the early 90s, and the phrase that came up was sink or swim, Justin. And that was very common within the sector, and it still is. So when you start working in housing, it is very, very common to have to manage by being thrown in the deep end and understanding the sink or swim. And I genuinely think that probably the training has reduced, not across the board. You know, there are organisations who undoubtedly will be training and supporting their staff well. But again, speaking to 100+ colleagues, the level of training and support due to cuts in services and the challenges around pressure of delivery has reduced, not increased. I think that staff working from home means that they're not experiencing the level of support, particularly, again, new members of staff learning from colleagues. And we know from stats that staff turnover has increased from 8% in the sector to 14%. So we've got experienced staff leaving the sector, and we're unable to attract as many staff coming into the sector. And this is creating a pressure, and we need to act. And so, hence the reason why the feedback came through from all of this research that I did, which is we need to change. And ultimately, one of the things that was really, really important was the conversation you and I had, Lucy, which was you called it out. You called it out and said, this sink or swim culture that is embedded within housing, it's not right. You know, the amount of stuff that housing staff and the managers above them and the leaders above them that are having to deal with is directly comparable to other parts of the public sector who are managing it completely differently in terms of the challenges that they're experiencing. And as a result of that, you and I started investigating what the solutions would be like and learning from other parts of the public sector. And we think that there is a way that we can be addressing this issue without it costing any more money, without material change, but it will require a change in thought process, a change in thinking within the sector. And I think it's we need to act now in order to be able to do it. So I guess that's the history of housing, the history of my career in it, and how I've experienced it, but and how everybody else is experiencing it, and what it is that we need to do in order to be able to move that forward.
Thank you, Justin. And please, everyone on the call, do feel free to drop in the chat, whether it's to the public chat or to me, if you want it to be private. Does that resonate? You know, do you feel like, I'm assuming because of the topic of the call that the majority of people on it are from the housing sector. Does it feel right? Does it feel like what we're saying is accurate? Does it feel like there is the right level of support in place for people, whether they're new to the sector or experienced? But that does lead us really nicely into asking you, Adrian. So you've obviously grown up in a different part of the public sector where my perception as an outsider, again, is that it's taken a lot more seriously, I think, in terms of it being embedded in structures and ways of working, and even at a regulatory level. Do you want to talk us through your perceptions of how that can look like?
Yeah, I think, as Justin said, there are some enormous similarities in terms of what Justin has just said to the sort of social care world. I recognise that completely, but I think the role of recognising the challenges and the burdens on individual staff, I think that is different. And you know, I've chaired corporate housing improvement boards where, much now to my, I suppose, you know, regret, this wasn't a conversation that happened with regard to the workforce. And now my reflection is, I think it is a conversation that should have happened. You know, because if I think about social care, supervision, for example, is much more embedded in the social care world. So just responding to Justin's provocation around sink or swim, you know, if you are a newly qualified social worker, you will have a weekly supervision for your first 6 weeks of practice. Then for the first 6 months, it will be fortnightly. After that, it will be monthly. But as a rule of thumb, that will vary depending on circumstances, and supervisions would usually be an hour to 2 hours long. And I think the key thing for me about supervision, it implies quite a managerial process, quite a task-based process. The best supervisions aren't that. So it's not so much about talking about the what and the when, it's the how and the why. So increasingly in social care, there's been a move to what we call reflective supervision, which is really about exploring the individual's own emotional well-being and how that emotional well-being is impacting on their casework. So, for example, if you have a social worker who's feeling very anxious. Something might be happening in their personal life. It might be happening in their professional life. They might be really worried about a family. They might really not like a father, etc., etc. All of that will have an impact on how they manage that case. And the best supervisions really start to probe that. It's about, how are you feeling? How are those feelings reflecting on how you're undertaking that work? It's really getting that sense of feeling how people are sort of sensing the work that they do, and then moving that on into the impact on the casework and the change. There is a hard edge to that. It's not all about responding to people's feelings. It's very much translating that onto how people essentially how that's impacting on the cases and what adjustments people want to make. But it's very much intended to be that supportive process for the individual worker, and recognizing that people's emotional state moves up and down, of course, as everybody else's does. There's also some really interesting work around group supervision, so not necessarily a simple line management function, but actually how, as a group of practitioners, can you have a supervision amongst yourselves, which I've seen in practice can be really effective in terms of providing a wider range of views, both in terms of support and challenge to preconceptions about situations or families or individual staff. And there is that focus on emotional well-being within the supervision process. Again, those authorities, and I'm sure colleagues on the call will be aware of, issues such as trauma-informed practice. Well, some of the benefits of trauma-informed practice is you can turn that inward as well as outward in terms of what's the role of trauma within the social work that is being done. For example, what's the role of trauma in terms of the individual worker's response to a situation. So it's very much part of the core social work task. I think, as you alluded to, it is regulated. When Ofsted turn up at Children's Services Department, they will ask to see the supervision records. They will ask to they will talk to social workers about their experience of supervision, and they will form a judgment on that basis. And it's very rare do you see an authority which gets a really poor grading and it says the supervision is wonderful. Those two things often come together, and that's partly often obviously because of caseloads, demand on time, supervision tends to get eroded, and that's when many authorities start to hit problems.
Yeah. And what's your view, and this question is posed to both of you, because there is obviously a social housing regulator. Is this something that, in the same way that it is with Ofsted, is this something that should be pushed by the regulator, or is it something that needs to be a sort of sector-driven approach? What are your thoughts on that?
I personally think it should be sector-driven, but maybe it's something the regulator should be conscious of. But I would hope that the sector could organise this itself rather than relying on the regulator, personally.
Yeah. And I suppose there is a risk when it's done by a regulator that things can become tick boxy and not necessarily for the right reasons. What's your view, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I'd see it as a partnership. Adrian's right, it needs to be sector led, because the role of the regulator isn't to go in there and solve the problems on behalf of the sector. They provide a framework in which the sector should operate, but what they are able to do is to help support and act as a catalyst around the conversation. And so if this was weaved into part of the way they understand what good looks like within the housing sector, and they're currently debating the competence and conduct standard at this moment in time, which has been out for consultation for some time. I think that weaving that in would make a big difference and potentially create some of that sea change around the cultural approach to it. So what it is that Adrian's outlined around the way other parts of the public sector operate is something that can be built in, and in some organisations it undoubtedly will be built in. It can be refined and improved, but there are large parts of the sector where that isn't built in at all, and a bit of regulator oversight would make a big difference in that regard. And it would be a recognition that you can't deliver good housing services if you don't have good trained staff and managers and leaders who understand how to support staff through some of these really difficult issues, and also providing the support to those leaders who are carrying quite a significant mental and emotional load as well.
Yeah. I suppose the other thing I'm curious about is, because resilience is an individual skill set, so that there is the stuff that organizations need to do better, and I'll talk through some of those from a psychology point of view shortly. But also there is an individual kind of, am I strengthening this muscle around resilience really? And I think, and I'm really interested in your views on this, Adrian. I imagine when people choose to become a social worker, and I happen to have a family full of social workers, they make that choice from a place of, you can never really know until you're in it how bad things can be, but they are making that as a conscious choice, knowing that they're going to be really confronted with some very difficult and emotionally challenging things. I wonder if that's true of housing officers, because I wonder, are they blindsided? Because when they think, well, I'm going to go into housing and help people get into housing, they may not necessarily realise when they're entering that sector the level of things that they're going to have to deal with. Is that a fair comment, do you think?
I think it is. As you say, I think generally people know, they largely know what to expect when they're coming into social care. They know the role, and to a certain extent, the role has developed in order to recognise that. So there are a range of mechanisms to help you manage the situations that you are in. Personally, I think probably housing isn't so developed in terms of that space. In social work, we always talk about the sort of the Friday afternoon feeling. If you're finishing for the Friday, what are you thinking about that child, that relationship? Are you able to essentially say, can you go into the weekend in a place of safety mentally without spending your weekend, almost paralyzed with concern around what's happening in that child's life? Are there support mechanisms there that essentially help you to share that risk, help you to share that worry? So essentially the organization takes some of that load off your shoulders. I'm not sure that's the same in other sort of council functions, including housing, which have tended still to see the work in a more transactional way and perhaps not recognise as much the emotional burden that can come with the work that we do, as Justin said, increasingly across the public sector rather than just within certain parts of the sector, such as social work.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I think Adrian is using very cautious language over it, and I can be a little bit blunter. I was 17 when I took the decision to move into housing, and to even pretend that I had any knowledge of the emotional demand and the sorts of situations that I would be facing would be absurd. So, I took the decision, and I certainly don't regret taking that decision. But as a 17-year-old, you're clearly not equipped to be able to understand what it is that you're going to be facing in a 35, 40-year housing career. And was I equipped in order to be able to manage that? I did a degree in housing. So, the course on reflection would have been around the history of housing, tenancy, development, repairs, asset management, housing finance, all those homelessness, all those sorts of things that gave me a broad knowledge and understanding of housing. But again, aside from 2 or 3 placements, ultimately my first real role in housing was when I became a housing officer. Despite all of that degree training, I was woefully unprepared for what it is that I had to deal with the benefit of hindsight. And I could have received more support. And I had a really good support employer. They were very supportive. Nonetheless, it was still a challenging environment. And if you speak to the vast majority of people that go into housing, they will say that it's a really common phrase, they fell into housing. So for whatever reason, they found themselves with a career in housing, and they just found a way of progressing that all the way up to chief exec in some instances, but very, very few people grow up thinking, I want to be a housing officer as opposed to a train driver. And so, they tend to find it via all sorts of different routes rather than that proactive decision.
Yeah. And you did touch on there the education, which again, people that choose to go into social work, I imagine, I've not done a social work degree, but I imagine that it is covered, that sense of resilience. This is what you can expect. Here are some skills you can learn. Here's emotional intelligence models. I imagine that is covered. It's certainly covered in my field in psychology. So I do organizational psychology. So the emotional demands are not as high, but people that are doing things around therapy and quite in-depth therapy, there is a lot there of just basics of almost a housekeeping of your own mind. And similar to what you said, Adrian, that ability to put something down, a bit of almost a distance from it, and also having people in your life, in your professional life, where they don't call it supervision in the same way, but that concept of, if you've done a really difficult therapy session with somebody, you then need to debrief, so you're not carrying that. That's a very well known and understood concept. I'm guessing it's not covered in housing education. Well, it might not have been when you were 17, but I don't know if there's anybody on the call that's willing to say whether they've recently done more training. But is it part of that skill set of becoming a housing officer in terms of the educational route, do we think?
It's still not there. So at the CIH conference that I've at in the last couple of days, we were having that very discussion. And as a sector, we need to focus on professionalization. We need to skill people up in terms of the ability to be able to do the job. And again, with the benefit of, a long career in housing, the breadth that there is to housing is absolutely immense, and it is continuing to increase. When you consider what I said at the beginning of the call in terms of the level of involvement in all different parts of the public sector, you end up finding yourself being a sort of a lay expert in a whole range of different aspects of service provision, because as a strategic leader, you find yourself in conversations with people around wider public policy. And it is so often the case that the conversation eventually comes around to, well, if people were adequately housed in good, secure accommodation, a lot of the social challenges that they currently experience would be less of a problem. And so at what point do you draw the line in terms of what it is that you require around the skill sets of individual members of staff? And even if you move outside the sort of legislation and policy side of stuff, you've still got to have equipped people in the ability to be able to deal with that aggression on the front line in terms of managing that. Also, lone working conversations, there's a whole heap of stuff that also has to be worked through to make sure that people are equipped to be able to do the job. To layer on top of that a whole mechanism relating to emotional demands and emotional resilience is another ask. And so it's a real challenge for the sector. I think that what's emerged from the research that we've done in the last few weeks is we have to do it because otherwise we're just not going to move forward as a sector.
Yeah. And I mean, the psychology stuff does back up that need to do it. So there's a few different models, and I'd be curious, Adrian, to see if the language may well be different in terms of how they've implemented into social care. But there's a popular model called jobs, demand, hyphen resources, which is basically a lot of organizational psychology. I feel like I have to apologize for, because a lot of it is a bit Captain Obvious, but it is the concept of, do our demands in our job balance with our resources that we have available? And by resources, that might be support systems, it might be literal financial resources, we can afford the right to, resource in the team, or it might be your own personal mental resource. And that within that model, it recognizes that there are different types of demands, and something that we do fall a bit guilty of, I think, in the public sector, where we're often having to account for budgets almost to the minute, is we want to really analyze time, because time costs money. But actually, in terms of the demands on staff, they can be your demands in terms of emotional, like we're talking about. It can be physical demands. You know, some jobs are extremely physically demanding. It can be cognitive demands, so having to make decisions very quickly. It can be that time and workload, and it can be bureaucratic and organizational demands. So being able to look at a role and really reflect on what are the different types of demands happening here enables organizations to then assess more accurately whether the resources are in place or not. And I think that we have been guilty in many parts of the public sector of focusing pretty much entirely on time and workload and not necessarily thinking about cognitive demand. And we all experience it. You know, I know for me personally, I am not stressed when I have to get up and talk in front of a room full of people, which would stress a lot of people out. I'm stressed when I've got a load of crappy little admin jobs, because that is like my cognitive load. Then it's messing with my ability to just get stuff done. And so looking at jobs through that lens, I think, is really powerful. There is other models around things like emotional intelligence. So the job demands resources is very much an organizational view, but from an individual view, we can teach people to be more emotionally intelligent, which means we can teach people about why they feel certain ways and how emotions impact them. And I think that comes back to that personal resilience and that awareness of what am I taking home? What am I leaving at the door? So I think that's definitely something that would help the sector. And there's a lot of stuff at the moment about psychological safety, which is basically an environment or a culture in the workplace where people are able to be vulnerable and people are able to ask questions and challenge things and say that I'm struggling. And people often misinterpret that as it being a very happy, peaceful workplace. It's actually not. It's how we handle conflict and how we are able to drop our guard and be vulnerable and be authentic and say, no, this doesn't feel right. So I feel like there's a combination of things going on in the more academic psychology world that are really pointing to the importance of this. And there is a lot of research around that jobs demand and resource model, and it's linked to burnout. That model is there to prevent burnout, because burnout doesn't always come from the things that we think it comes from. So again, if we focus solely on workload, it can come from too much workload, but often people are saying their workload is high because they're struggling to articulate that it is in fact the emotional workload that's high. So it's difficult to necessarily pull that out with a data basis. There's different demands and all of them can cause burnout, and it's about getting that balance right. How does that resonate with you, Adrian? With you, I know it will be different language and different.
No, but it resonates a lot. I think, as I say, I think, again, supervision can seem very much like a task-based approach, and there's almost an archetypal supervision, which starts with how are you? Okay, now we've done the emotional stuff. Now let's talk about the cases. I think, as I was saying before, the best supervisions bring those conversations together. If you are anxious about the safety of a child, that anxiety is going to impact on how you are working with that child. The child will pick that up, the parents will pick that up. And it will impact on the other cases. If you're worried about one particular case, it will impact on how you are working with the others. So the best supervisions bring the answer to that how are you, and then apply that to the casework. What does that mean for the work that you're doing? What does it mean that you're feeling anxious? What does it mean for how you're interacting with that family? What's your view of the long-term outcome for that family? But again, I think the trick is not to make that a negative, as you were saying. We're all anxious. We're all anxious about different things. It's recognizing that and having that explicit conversation about it, but doing it from almost a strengths-based approach rather than seeing emotions as a negative and getting in the way of operational delivery of a task. We need to be much more intuitive and understanding of the complexity almost of human beings while they're undertaking these incredibly difficult roles. And that's why supervision, it takes time. And my fear is that time, it often gets eroded by what people see as the other pressures on the job, but actually those other pressures can be fed by the lack of good, effective supervision. Justin was talking about the turnover rate in housing. Well, turnover rates in social care, they've been up to 20, 30%. And that's because we have struggled to support staff with the complexity and the toll of the work over time. I think the sector is getting better at it, but there's still a long way to go in that space.
Yeah, and there is a risk as well. There was some research done specific to that emotional demands kind of area that said that people that work in roles where the emotional demands are high and they don't have that support, they go one of two ways. They either hit burnout and leave, or they become less empathetic, which there is a sweet spot there, because if you're too empathetic, then you're going to be taking everything home. But equally, I love your use of the strength-based concept there, because people are coming into these sectors because they care about people. We do not want to drum that out of them. We don't. We want to build on that strength where, we want social workers that care about people. And although the housing staff may not have come into it knowing there was such a people element, but the ones that stay because they care about people, because they're passionate about helping people to improve their lives. So we need to find a way where we get that balance right, where they are being able to express those emotions, and those emotions are celebrated without it becoming so that the demands are so high they're unable to do their job. I think there's a real challenge of getting that balance right.
I think that's right. And I think I said before, the focus of supervision is to ensure better outcomes for children and young people. There is that edge to it. It's recognizing that's what we're there to deliver. It's not a therapy function.
No.
At all. Social workers, social work managers, they're not trained therapists. That's not what it's there for. There is the option, there is counselling and therapy available to staff if that's what they wish. But the supervision session is very much about, the outcomes for the children and young people that we're supporting.
Yeah.
So this has come out very strongly in the discussions that I've been having and the research that I've been having. And it's exactly as you've just described, both of you. As a sector, what we aren't doing is separating out the emotional demands aspect from those conversations. And in many instances, we're not resourced to be able to have the level of supervision sessions that we do. And they are too transactional, as you pointed out earlier in the conversation as well, because we're very driven by performance, etc. But when you do, and you and I have done this, Lucy, when you do have the conversation with people in terms of the importance of separating out the emotional load that they're experiencing from the workload on a day-to-day basis, as a sector, it has become quite stark now, where you could be in a week, you could be dealing with 100 tasks, 95 of which you're resourced to be able to deal with, you're trained to be able to deal with, and you can cope with those relatively easily. But 5 of those tasks, and particularly one of them, is very challenging. It's a conflict situation, or it's a trauma situation, and it is impacting that member of staff in a way that affects the whole of the 100 tasks that they're dealing with. And so when you have that conversation with frontline staff and with colleagues in terms of the way they think that the sector is experiencing challenge and burnout, and you point out that it's managing those 1 or 5 cases during the week in a very different way compared to the 95 cases, all of a sudden you're accessing a very different conversation with that member of staff. Rather than it being, I can't cope, I've got too much work, it's actually my workload is manageable if I'm able to manage the very challenging situations that I've come across in that week. So I'm not taking it home, and it's not influencing the way I'm dealing with the rest of my caseload. And I think as a sector, again, reflecting on what Adrian was saying around the way children's services manage that, if we were to take some of that learning and apply it to the conversations we're having around my workload is too demanding conversations, I think we can move forward in so many different instances. Yeah.
So let's explore then, because we've had a good 40 minutes describing the problem, and and it's a bit depressing. Let's move forward into So what do we think we should do? So I think that shining a spotlight on there are different types of demands. I think that without getting too psychology geeky, that model, that jobs demands resources model, I think is a useful one. And we could definitely tailor that to housing and put examples of, you know, these are different types of tasks. I think shining that spotlight on so that people build their own awareness is really powerful. I think maybe doing some cultural work to embed some of that conversation. So it's not just that we're getting people to tell us what their demands are, actually getting managers and leaders when they're doing things like, you know, restructures and changing the way their services are run. I think embedding some of that thinking into that process is really important. And Adrian, what advice would you give? So if you were just ended up suddenly in housing next week, what would you bring from your world of social care to help fix this problem?
I do think it's a process that needs some structure. You know, this won't develop through osmosis. It is going to need somebody to be brave and say, well, actually, we are going to find the time to put aside for, you know, good, effective supervision. Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the key challenges, but probably one of the key roles of leadership is to create the time and the expectation around supervision. So I think that's the first thing that I would do. You know, social work has been at this for 20 years and still hasn't got it absolutely right. So again, it's reflecting it's on a journey. This is not something that can be done overnight, but getting those basics in place, along with some tools and with some training as well, is going to be needed, because it is a skill in terms of providing effective supervision. There are some, you know, basics people need to be aware of around to do and what to do. I think it's probably part of a wider piece around, I think you were mentioning that sense of sort of psychological safety in the workforce. It's about organizations thinking about how they can support the psychological and indeed physical safety of their workforce. Again, it needs an environment, as you say, Lucy, that people feel that they can be open, they can share. So, you know, there are some cultural things that might need to be reflected on, and it's a journey. But as I said, I think it needs structure around it to start with, and it needs probably organizational support to do that. In my experience, to be honest, I don't think, you know, corporate supervision arrangements really cut the mustard in this space. This isn't what they were designed to do. So it needs something different.
And well, I was doing a little bit of research around other, because obviously we're talking about housing and social care, but there are other parts of the public sector that have to deal with this kind of stuff. Police officers, many forces will implement something called critical incident stress debriefing, and there's a similar thing in fire and rescue where they have what they describe as structured decompression periods after major incidents. So I think it's worth looking at this on a timeline as well, because I think there's something about skilling people as they come into the sector, which in the social work world is that equivalent of you learning about this is the sort of stuff you're going to be dealing with. There is the almost preventative work of supervision, which is, are we keeping this balance right? You know, we understand the different demands, but then there is always going to be actually an incident has happened that is really going to impact you. You may have, you know, found something or seen something. What is the process then for that decompression or that management of letting go of some of that? So I think it is worth thinking about on different levels, and because there is a risk, and I take on board what you were saying, that this does need to be sector led to some degree, because there is a risk that if we do it as too much of a top down thing and a structural thing, that it just focuses on, right, well, we've put some meetings in the diary, therefore it'll be okay. Because I think there's different needs from staff at different points in time. I'm really curious as well, people that are on the call, what have you seen done well? What have you seen happen in your organisations or in other organisations that you think could help with this? You know, let's take this opportunity to share learning. So please do raise your hand or pop in the chat if you've seen any good practice. Justin, what do you think would help? What would your advice be to a housing manager at the moment that needs to expand the thinking around this?
Yeah, so I completely agree with what you and Adrian have said around that. What I would add to that is that it's okay to have the conversation in advance as well. So you know, there are a lot of experienced housing colleagues on the call, and the opportunity to be able to have a conversation with them and say, look, this is, you know, if you're a new member of staff, you know, you're 22 years old, you've come into housing and we're recruiting those people and that's working well, then these are the sorts of things that you are going to experience if you're going to have a 40-year career in housing. And that's okay, because you will be trained in order to be able to manage those from a procedural point of view, and you'll have the skills to be able to do it. But we will also provide you with the skills and support to be able to cope with that at the time, and for you to understand the impact that that might have, so that you'll be able to manage that in a more positive way. And so the benefit of that is by having those conversations in a safe space before they happen with people who have experienced it, then you feel a lot more equipped and a lot more confident in terms of managing that when it happens, not if it happens, when it happens. Again, the research is that long list that I put together in the blog in terms of what it is that I've experienced in my career. People had their own variation of it, but they all said, yes, that represents a career in housing. So, you know, and people are, again, you know, all the people I spoke to, they'd still choose housing again because it's real, it's meaningful, it makes a real difference to people's lives. And it, you know, again, it's providing that assurance. It's not scaring people off. It's just providing them with what it is that they need to be able to manage that process more positively.
Yeah.
Just to add to a point you made, Lucy, I was just reflecting, you know, I've been involved in lots of cases which are essentially, you know, multi-agency cases. And usually when something tragic happens around the death of a child, you have a review process, lots of agencies are involved. And just reflecting on that, because I've not really thought about this previously. If I think about, you know, something tragic has happened to a child, you might have around the table, as part of the review process, you'll have police, you'll have social work, you'll have housing, you'll have the NHS, you could have 9 or 10 different agencies. My guess is the organisation response to providing support to the workers that have been involved in that case will vary enormously across those 9 or 10 agencies. There is no consistency or perhaps even recognition of the impact of those events, even just sitting around that table talking about what's happened can have on the worker. So again, there's something there about actually we need to have a sort of collective view on how we support the workforce.
Yeah, I think so, because I think there's a lot of good practice. I mean, there will be slightly different experiences, and the area I've not looked at is the armed forces. But you know, I mean, they're dealing with some horrendous stuff, and often with, you know, long periods away from home. So I think, but really, we're all human beings, and although the context might be slightly different, the psychological needs, I think, will be consistent. So yeah, I think a piece of research that's pulling all that together would be massively helpful. Justin, why is now the time to act? Why is this important now?
So I think that
Coming.
Sorry?
What's coming next that's going to make
coming next? So
harder?
I think the sector is continuing to experience more of what it has done in recent years. Again, part of the research, you know, I was reflecting back 30 years, but somebody just this morning was reflecting back saying, you know, in the last 2 or 3 years, it's materially changed in the way that you've described, Justin. So I think that what we're experiencing is an acceleration rather than, you know, we have been through a period of change and it's going to ease off. And so we've got the Renters' Rights Act coming through, which I think is going to change a lot of the demand on the services, because that's a fundamental change in the housing sector as a whole. I think that there still isn't enough money coming from central government around housing, which I think is going to be a real issue. And depending on how the new government decides where to apportion its money, will depend on whether or not other parts of the public sector continue to withdraw from that. If they are able to achieve 1.5 million homes in this parliament, that introduces a whole heap of change as well, because if people are taking on new stock, that creates change around that side of it as well. And then technology is going to continue to change. So you put all of that together, and as you and I have said many times, Lucy, we need to be equipping staff with the ability to be able to manage change effectively, because nobody on this call and nobody in the sector thinks that we're about to hit a period of calm. And so if we continue to fail to invest in staff around their management of change, we're going to experience more people leaving the sector, and that's going to exacerbate the problem, because the people that are there are going to be having to manage more and more of the challenges that are both external and internal. So I think everybody would recognise that we do need to act, and you know, there are ways in which we can solve those problems.
Yeah. And I do wonder as well, and I'm flying on the seat of my pants with this a bit, and I'm a bit cautious about, you know, when people talk about generational differences and so on, because it's not as evidence-backed as people would like to think it is. But I do see a general shift in society and values that is more towards people are valuing well-being more. People are valuing, you know, kind of having a good work-life balance more. I think we seem to be moving away from this more submissive, we all just go to work and do as we're told vibe, and people are wanting to engage more, they want in more depth. There is some research to say that younger people look much more at the values of the organization they work in than perhaps older generations might have been. You know, you just need a stable job and you need to stay in the same place for a long time. So there are patterns on a societal level where I think we are, as a human race, becoming much more aware of things like emotional demands and needs, and mental health and well-being. And I suppose what worries me is when you look at what's going on in the sector aligned with that, are we just going to end up losing more and more people if we don't get this right? And it's sad, because people that want to stay in the sector, and I've only been in the sector for sort of 18 months to 2 years, but I see the same as what I see in other parts of the public sector, which is people that frankly aren't there for the money, because the money ain't good. They are there because they care very deeply about making a difference to the people they work with. You wouldn't do this sort of work if you didn't care, because it's too much hassle if you don't. Like, none of these jobs are easy, are they? So we're attracting people that have this high level of emotional investment in their work. We have to find a way to get that right without them actually just hitting burnout because the emotional demand is too high. And I think combined with the societal changes of people are looking for more awareness and more well-being focused approaches, I think it feels like it's a potentially urgent issue. I don't know if you both think that's fair.
I personally, I think it's very fair, and I said it's a situation that sort of social work has been in for a number of years now, and you know, I've always been, you know, I've been tempted to essentially, you know, compete on the money side as well, but you know, for some authorities that's just not possible. And actually, we find that, you know, the money's great, but actually, you know, if you can't support people to have a life outside of work, if you can't support them to manage those worries and manage those anxieties, they will leave, and they'll
Yeah,
either leave to go somewhere else or they will leave the profession.
yeah.
You know, that's almost an inevitability, I'm afraid. So, you know, I do think this is this is really important to any organisation's plans
Yeah.
around retaining and developing their workforce.
Yeah. So, big takeaway, I think for me, it is that I know obviously I'm biased towards the geeky stuff, but that concept of think about what are the different types of demands in a role, I think would be a big takeaway. And something that when I'm working with people in the sector, I would be encouraging them to do. Don't just focus on workload, focus on different types of demands, and let's start to shine a spotlight on that. Justin, what would your big takeaway be from this conversation?
So yeah, I think there are four things that I think we need to be doing. One is investing in that conversation with staff before they experience what it is that they're experiencing. I think we can change the way we do the supervisions, and make sure that people are we're separating out the functional, the transactional part of the staff roles in order to be able to provide a good quality conversation outside of the meeting. I think that we need to be recognising the cumulative effect on some of the leaders within the profession as well. You know, a lot of those challenging cases are just feeding their way up the chain, and the challenges that staff are experiencing have to be dealt with and managed effectively by the leaders. So they're carrying a lot of emotional load in that respect. So understanding that and supporting staff in that way. And then I also think that there is a sector-wide conversation which works in partnership with the regulator in order to be able to have a different conversation. And all of that is very, very manageable. That is not asking for pound signs from anybody. It is just a shift in the way the sector is behaving and thinking.
Yeah, thank you. Adrian, what are your takeaways from today?
I think it is about having that honest conversation about the demands of the role and what that means. I think as Justin said, it's not the roles that were 10 years ago, it's the roles of today. I think it is about organizations investing in time. It's not necessarily the money, but it is the time to enable supervision. And I think it's allowing conversations about emotions and feelings that they're legitimate and not almost designing those out.
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of where we're at Truman Change, so this is a topic of interest for us at the moment and something that we are researching, and we're trying to bring together best practice from other parts of the sector, but also that psychology space of, you know, that evidence base. How do our brains work and what helps us and what doesn't? We'd love to keep in touch with you as we develop this. If you feel it's something that you need some help with, then please do talk to us. We can come in and run longer, more detailed sessions like this about different models with your managers or with your staff. We can look at your culture, or we can partner up with you to do a more fundamental change if that's what you need. But in the meantime, we also are just interested in talking to people about this, because we want to build up a picture of how do we apply all of this best practice and psychology information really specifically into the housing sector, and what would help you to be able to make this transition and this shift. So please do reach out to either myself or Justin if you're up for helping us with that. If you want to have a conversation about how we can help you, then we'd love to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We do run these as a series, and we do have a couple more in the diary, and there's one that we agreed to run yesterday that's not in the diary yet, that's not on our website yet, which will be towards the end of this month, about local government reorganisation. But we basically run them every few weeks. We pick a topic and we have either a panel or sometimes it's a presentation of research. They're always free to attend, and so please do come on future ones if they're of interest. You will get an email probably early next week, by the time our marketing person has turned it around and edited the video and put it online. So you'll get a link to the recording of this once it's online. So if it's something that you think your colleagues would benefit from, then do feel free to share that. That's an open link. So anybody that wants to take part in this conversation is very welcome to. I did mention at the start of the call that I have another venture called Reimagine Events, where we're running an event in June in Manchester, which is, the title is Reimagine Local Government, and the concept is that people come. So for those of you that are from local government rather than housing associations, come along, bring a couple of colleagues, bring a topic of something that you are trying to change, and it is in effect like a shared team away day. So we'll have lots of discussion in the morning about different ways of doing change and transformation, talking about culture, about engagement, about community engagement. And then in the afternoon, we'll split you into groups where we'll be focusing on topics like local government reorganisation, bringing in AI, how to engage well, all, you know, kind of more specific things. So if that's something that you think would be useful, if you're working on a particular meaty, challenging issue, this could be that issue. How do we change culture within our housing services? Then come and join us on that day. And it's a sort of joint between a facilitation and a learning event, but very much with your colleagues, and you'll be progressing the issue on the day. I also just wanted to drop in the chat the blog which Justin mentioned, which some of you may have already seen, but Justin has written a blog where it's, again, kind of summarising some of the stuff that we've talked about today, in case that is helpful. And finally, just a massive, massive thank you to both Justin and Adrian for giving up your time today to wax lyrical with us about this really, really important topic. We really do appreciate it, and those of you that know me will know I'm always up for some sort of geeky psychological conversation where we delve into something at quite some depth. So thank you for your both time and emotional labor, because these things do take a bit of an emotional investment too. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining the call. Do reach out if there's anything we can do.
Thanks for joining the call, everyone. Thanks, Adrian. Thanks, Lucy.